The clock was running out. It was late on June 24th, 1959, inside the Nebraska State Penitentiary. Behind one of the prison doors sat a 20-year-old man who knew exactly how much time he had left. His name was Charles Starkweather. More than a year earlier, his name had been associated with one of the most notorious killing sprees in Nebraska history. 11 people were dead. A teenage girl had been drawn into the case. A nationwide manhunt had followed. And eventually, a courtroom had delivered its answer: death. Now there was nothing left to investigate, nothing left to appeal, nothing left to run from. Only the clock. Every minute that passed brought Starkweather closer to the electric chair. He had already eaten his final meal. He had spent his final hours inside the prison. And as midnight approached, an extraordinary complication occurred. The prison physician who was expected to participate in the execution suffered a fatal heart attack. For a brief moment, even death seemed to have been interrupted. But the execution would go ahead. Soon, officers would walk toward Starkweather's cell. Soon, the door would open. Soon, he would take the final walk of his life. And somewhere beyond those prison walls were the families of the people he had killed. They had already lived through the parts Starkweather was now waiting to experience. The final moment. The difference was that they never knew it was coming. Robert Colvert didn't know. Velda Bartlett didn't know. Marion Bartlett didn't know. 2-year-old Betty Jean Bartlett certainly didn't know. Robert Jensen didn't know. Carole King didn't know. The Ward family didn't know. Lillian Fenkel didn't know. And Merle Collison didn't know. 11 lives. 11 endings. And one killer waiting for his own. But before the electric chair, before the final meal, before the prison cell, there was a different Charles Starkweather, a teenager in Nebraska, a young man who believed the world had turned against him, a young man who fell in love, a young man who committed one murder and then made a choice that changed everything. This is not just the story of how Charles Starkweather died. It is the story of how the clock started ticking in the first place. December 1957. Lincoln, Nebraska. The city had no reason to believe that it was about to become the starting point of a killing spree that would dominate headlines across America. Charles Starkweather was 19 years old. He was not yet a household name. He was not yet a fugitive. He was not yet sitting on death row. He was simply a young man living in Lincoln. But there were already signs that something was wrong. Starkweather had struggled socially and academically. He had been mocked by other young people and carried a deep resentment toward those he believed had humiliated him. He also developed an increasingly troubled relationship with society around him. He had difficulty holding steady employment. He stole. He became fascinated with rebellion and violence. And he began developing a worldview in which other people were responsible for his frustrations. But none of that made what happened next inevitable. People experience rejection. People experience anger. People struggle. Most never become murderers. Starkweather eventually made decisions that belonged to him. And one of those decisions would create the first body. His victim was Robert Colvert. Colvert was 21 years old and working at a service station in Lincoln. On December 1st, Starkweather went to the station. An argument developed over money and a purchase. What happened next turned an ordinary disagreement into murder. Starkweather forced Colvert into a vehicle. He drove him away from the station, and then he killed him. The first murder had happened. But here's what makes the case so important. At that moment, nobody knew what it meant. There was no way for police to look into the future and see the 10 bodies that would follow. There was no reason for the public to believe that a 19-year-old from Lincoln was about to become the center of one of America's most infamous murder cases. The killing could have been an isolated crime. Starkweather could have been arrested. The case could have ended there. But he wasn't immediately caught, and that gave him something extremely dangerous: time. He went back to his life. He continued seeing Carl Fugate. And for a brief period, it was possible to imagine that the murder of Robert Colvert might remain the worst thing Starkweather would ever do. That possibility disappeared in January, because Starkweather was about to return to the home of the girl he was dating. And this time, he would not leave the same way he arrived. Carol Ann Fugate was 14 years old. Her family home in Lincoln was occupied by her mother, Velda Bartlett, her stepfather, Marion Bartlett, and her young half-sister, Betty Jean. When Starkweather arrived, the situation became deadly. The details of exactly what happened inside that house would later become one of the most controversial parts of the entire case. But the result was undeniable. Velda Bartlett was dead. Marion Bartlett was dead. And Betty Jean Bartlett was dead. 3 people from one family, including a 2-year-old child. The killing spree had changed completely. This was no longer one murder committed during an argument. There were now multiple victims, and Starkweather was still free. That is when the clock really began moving. Because once there are multiple bodies, investigators begin looking for patterns. Once there is a pattern, they begin looking for a suspect. And once the suspect is identified, the race begins. But Starkweather wasn't waiting for police. He was moving. And the next people he encountered had no idea that they were about to become part of the story. Robert Jensen and Carole King were teenagers. They were together when Starkweather crossed their path. Within a short time, both were dead. 2 more names, 2 more families destroyed. And now, the number of victims was growing faster than anyone could have imagined. Starkweather and Fugate continued moving. The roads became their escape route. The stolen vehicles became their means of transportation. And the farther they traveled, the more difficult it became for authorities to know exactly where they were. Then came the Ward home. C. Lauer Ward, his wife, Clara, and their housekeeper, Lillian Fenkel. 3 more victims. The killing spree had now become a trail stretching across locations and communities. And every new crime increased the pressure on law enforcement. But Starkweather still had one more person in his path, a traveling salesman named Merle Collison. Collison was resting inside his vehicle near Douglas, Wyoming. He had no connection to Starkweather, no connection to Fugate, no connection to the other victims. He was simply a man sleeping in his car. Then Starkweather arrived. Collison was killed. And with that, the number of known victims connected to the killing spree reached 11. 11 people, in a matter of weeks. But Starkweather had made one mistake. The authorities were finally catching up. The stolen vehicle had created a trail. The descriptions had spread. The police were watching the roads. And the fugitive, who had seemed to move wherever he wanted, was about to discover that the highways were no longer his escape. They were becoming a trap. Because somewhere ahead, a police officer was waiting. And this time, Charles Starkweather would not drive away. For days, Charles Starkweather had survived by moving. One road led to another. One stolen vehicle replaced another. And every time he left a crime scene behind, he created more distance between himself and the authorities. But distance only works when nobody knows where you are. By the time Starkweather and Carol Fugate reached Wyoming, the situation was changing. The murders had generated an enormous police response. Descriptions were circulating. Stolen vehicles were being reported. Law enforcement agencies were communicating across state lines, and newspapers were carrying the story to the public. The name Charles Starkweather was no longer unknown. People were beginning to recognize his face. The photograph of a young man had become associated with a terrifying question: where will he strike next? For Starkweather, however, there was no turning back. The murders had already happened. There were witnesses, evidence, vehicles, and crime scenes connecting the events. Even if he wanted to disappear, he was leaving pieces of the story behind everywhere he went. And that is one of the most important things about the manhunt. Starkweather wasn't simply being chased by police. He was being chased by the evidence he had created. Every stolen car was another clue. Every witness was another risk. Every mile of highway created another opportunity for someone to recognize him. And eventually, one of those clues would bring the police directly to him. But before that happened, Starkweather and Fugate were still moving. The country around them was enormous. Nebraska and Wyoming contained miles of open roads and isolated stretches of land. In 1958, a person could travel a considerable distance without encountering the kind of surveillance that exists today. There were no smartphones, no GPS tracking, no modern camera networks, no instant digital alerts reaching millions of people. Police depended on radio communication, telephone calls, descriptions, license plates, roadblocks, and people paying attention. And people were paying attention. The story had become impossible to ignore. The public was learning that the suspect was young. That made the case even more unsettling. People expected dangerous criminals to look dangerous. Starkweather didn't fit the image many people had in their minds. He was barely out of his teens. He could have looked like any other young man traveling across the country. That was part of what made the case so frightening. The danger didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looked ordinary. But behind the ordinary appearance was a trail of 11 deaths. And now, police were getting closer. The final confrontation began near Douglas, Wyoming. Starkweather had taken the car belonging to Merle Collison, but the vehicle itself became a problem. Collison's car had an automatic transmission. Starkweather had difficulty operating it. The vehicle became stuck. That small mechanical problem mattered, because Starkweather could no longer simply drive away. He needed help. And asking for help was exactly what he didn't need. A passing motorist noticed the situation. A local law enforcement officer became involved. And suddenly, Starkweather was no longer alone on an empty road. There were people around him. People who were beginning to understand that something wasn't right. The police confronted him. For a fugitive who had spent days trying to remain unpredictable, this was the moment the strategy collapsed. There was nowhere to go. The roads that had carried him away from one crime scene after another had finally brought him to a dead end. Starkweather surrendered. The manhunt was over. For the first time since the killings began, he was no longer in control of where he was going. He was under arrest, and that changed everything. The authorities could now begin reconstructing the entire sequence. They had the suspect. They had the vehicles. They had the crime scenes. They had witnesses. And they had the opportunity to question the person at the center of it all. But one major question remained. Why? Why had a 19-year-old committed so many murders? Why had one killing become several? And why had the violence continued even after the first opportunity to stop had passed? Investigators began trying to understand Starkweather's motives. There were discussions about his childhood, his relationships, his anger, his personality, his history of theft, his resentment toward other people. But there would never be one simple explanation capable of answering everything. A motive can explain what someone claims to have felt. It cannot erase what they chose to do. And the authorities also needed to understand Carol Fugate's role. She had been with Starkweather. She had been connected to the events at her family home. And she was only 14 years old. Her story would become one of the most controversial parts of the case. Fugate said Starkweather had threatened her. She later maintained that she had been afraid of him and had been forced to cooperate. But prosecutors presented a different interpretation. They argued that she had participated more willingly than she claimed. The question would eventually be decided in court. But before that happened, the public had already reached its own conclusions. Newspapers filled with details about the killings. The country wanted to know more about the young couple at the center of the case. The story was shocking because of the age of the suspects. It was shocking because of the number of victims. And it was shocking because the killings had unfolded so quickly. 8 days of violence had created a case that would remain in American criminal history for generations. But now the chase was finished. Starkweather was no longer a fugitive. He was a prisoner, and prisoners eventually face courtrooms. The legal system would now take over where the highways had left off. The first stage was determining the charges. The prosecution focused on murder. The evidence surrounding the killings was extensive. Starkweather eventually faced trial for the murder of Robert Jensen. The courtroom became the next stage of the story. The young man who had once been photographed beside cars and highways was now sitting before a judge and jury. There were lawyers on both sides. There were witnesses. There were photographs and evidence from the investigation. There was the story of what happened. And there was the question of punishment. The defense challenged aspects of the prosecution's case and Starkweather's mental state. But the jury ultimately convicted him of first-degree murder. Then came the sentence: death. The decision meant that Starkweather's story was no longer about whether he would be captured. That question had been answered. It was now about whether he would live. And the answer from the court was no. But an execution doesn't happen simply because a judge announces it. There are appeals, there are legal reviews, there are motions, there are delays. And for the condemned prisoner, there is something even more difficult: waiting. Starkweather was moved into the world of death row. The roads were gone. The courtroom was behind him. The crowds disappeared. What remained was a cell and a future that had already been decided. He knew the state intended to execute him, but he didn't know exactly when. Then a date would be scheduled, and he would wait. Another legal development could change the date. Another appeal could create a delay. And then the process would begin again. This was a different kind of confinement. As a fugitive, Starkweather had been running toward tomorrow. On death row, tomorrow was something he feared. Every morning meant another day alive, but also another day closer to the end. The man who had once controlled his own movement was now completely dependent on the decisions of judges, lawyers, prison officials, and the state. And eventually, those decisions would leave him with one final date: June 25th, 1959. This time, the execution would not be postponed. The countdown had finally become real. And now the story moved into its most unusual stage. Not the killing spree, not the manhunt, not the trial, but the final 24 hours. Because on the last day of Charles Starkweather's life, something happened that nobody could have predicted. The prison physician, who was expected to be present at his execution, suddenly died. And despite that extraordinary interruption, the clock kept moving. By the time Charles Starkweather entered death row, the world outside had already begun moving on. The newspapers that once carried his name across their front pages were eventually replaced by other stories. The crowds that had followed the trial disappeared. The courtroom doors closed. The witnesses went home. But inside the Nebraska State Penitentiary, Starkweather's case was not over. For him, the killing spree had been replaced by something quieter: waiting. He had been convicted of murdering Robert Jensen and sentenced to death. The state intended to execute him, but a death sentence does not immediately place a prisoner in the execution chamber. There are legal procedures, appeals, reviews, requests for stays, and every one of those processes can stretch time. For Starkweather, that meant living with the knowledge that his life had been given an expiration date. The strange thing about death row is that it can make time feel both slow and fast. A single day can feel endless, but weeks and months can disappear. Starkweather had already experienced the fear of being hunted. Now he experienced something completely different. There was nowhere to run. There was nothing to chase. He could not escape by taking another car. He could not disappear down another highway. The world had become a locked door, and behind that door, the future had already been decided. Starkweather's lawyers continued pursuing legal options. His family also hoped that his life could somehow be spared. But the conviction remained. The death sentence remained. And eventually, the state established an execution date. Then came another legal development. The date could be delayed. For a condemned prisoner, that kind of delay can be both a relief and another form of suffering. Imagine preparing yourself to die. You know the date. You know the approximate time. You understand what is waiting for you. Then, suddenly, you are told that you will not die that day. You remain alive. But the sentence has not disappeared. It has only moved. Starkweather eventually faced this kind of uncertainty as his legal challenges continued. The execution was postponed while the courts considered his case. But every delay only moved the final moment farther down the calendar. It did not erase it. Eventually, the legal road narrowed. There were fewer arguments left, fewer possibilities. And finally, the state settled on a new date, June 25th, 1959. This was the date that would become permanent. Starkweather would be executed at the Nebraska State Penitentiary. He was 20 years old, and now he knew when his life would end. The difference between knowing you will die someday and knowing the exact day is difficult to describe. The date becomes a presence. You can look at a calendar and see it. You can count backward. You can calculate how many mornings remain. You can imagine the final meal, the final conversation, the final walk, the final door. For Starkweather, that date was approaching. And as June 1959 arrived, the story began attracting renewed attention. Reporters remembered the murders. The public remembered the photographs. And the name Charles Starkweather once again appeared in newspapers. But this time, there was no manhunt. There was no mystery about where he was. Everyone knew. He was in prison, waiting. And perhaps that is what makes the final stage of the case so different from the beginning. At the start, Starkweather controlled the movement. He chose where to go. He chose which roads to take. He chose when to leave. By the end, he could not choose anything. The state controlled his schedule. The prison controlled his movements. And the clock controlled everything else. As the execution date approached, prison officials began making preparations. The execution chamber had to be ready. The electric chair had to be prepared. Witnesses would have to be notified. A doctor would have to be available. And Starkweather would eventually have to be taken from his cell. But there was still time. And on death row, time can become its own kind of prison. Every day could feel normal until the prisoner remembered what was waiting at the end. There was no possibility that Starkweather could simply forget. The execution date was always there. June 25th. It was printed. It was scheduled. It was coming. Then June 24th arrived. This was the final day, the last sunrise, the last afternoon, the last evening, and the last night. For Starkweather, there would be no June 26, no next weekend, no next month, no next year. The ordinary calendar had ended. Only the final 24 hours remained. Inside the prison, preparations continued. But the day itself would not begin with the execution. There were hours to pass first. Starkweather spent time inside the prison. He knew what was ahead, and as the day progressed, the reality of the final meal became unavoidable. Every condemned prisoner eventually reaches a moment when ordinary things become strangely significant. A glass of water, a conversation, a cigarette, a final letter, a meal. For Starkweather, the final meal was not extravagant. He had been offered steak. He declined it. Instead, he chose cold cuts. There would be no dramatic feast, no elaborate menu, just a simple meal before death. And when that meal was finished, another piece of the day disappeared. The plate was cleared. The food was gone. There would never be another meal. But the final meal was only the beginning of the final evening. There were still hours left. Starkweather reportedly spent some of that time writing and painting. The image is almost difficult to reconcile with the crimes that had brought him there. A young man sitting quietly, writing, painting, waiting. Outside that cell, however, preparations were becoming more serious. The witnesses would soon arrive. The execution chamber would soon be ready, and the prison physician was expected to be there. His name was Dr. B.A. Finkel. He was 75 years old. He had a role to perform that night. He was supposed to be present for the execution and help certify the death. But before Starkweather reached the electric chair, something completely unexpected happened. Dr. Finkel suffered a fatal heart attack. The prison had been preparing to take a man's life. Instead, the doctor responsible for participating in the process had died. For a moment, the execution itself was placed in an unusual situation. Would the execution be delayed? Would the state postpone it again? After all the legal delays, would another unexpected event push the date back? But the answer was no. The execution would continue. Another physician would be brought in. The preparations would resume, and the clock would keep moving toward midnight. That detail would become one of the strangest footnotes in the entire Starkweather story. The man who was supposed to witness the condemned prisoner's death had died before him. But Starkweather's death was still coming. The evening grew later. The prison became quieter. The final preparations continued. And somewhere inside the penitentiary, Starkweather was still alive. Every minute brought him closer. At 11 o'clock, the end was less than an hour away. At 11:30, it was even closer. Soon there would be no more waiting, no more preparation. No more time. Officers would come to his cell. The door would open, and the final walk would begin. For more than a year, Starkweather had been waiting for this moment. Now he had only minutes. The man who once tried to outrun police across the Great Plains was finally standing still, and the thing he could not escape was no longer a police officer. It was the clock. The final night began with something almost ordinary. At approximately midnight, officers came to Starkweather's cell. The moment he had spent more than a year anticipating had arrived. The cell door opened. Starkweather was escorted out. He was no longer being moved as a suspect. He was a condemned prisoner being taken to his execution. The walk itself was short, but the meaning of every step was enormous. There would be no return trip. There would be no second chance. There would be no appeal waiting at the end of the hallway. The legal system had finished its work. Now the sentence was being carried out. Starkweather entered the execution chamber. The electric chair was waiting. The chair had become the physical symbol of the sentence that had followed him since his conviction. He was positioned in it. The restraints were secured. The execution equipment was prepared. And the witnesses watched. There was no courtroom here. No jury. No arguments. No questions. Only silence. The final procedure began. Starkweather was 20 years old. He had been 19 when the killing spree began. Now, more than a year later, he was about to die. At approximately 12:01 a.m. on June 25, 1959, the execution began. The electrical current was applied, then repeated. The process involved multiple electrical charges, and after approximately 4 minutes, it was over. Charles Starkweather was dead, 20 years old. The manhunt was over. The trial was over. The appeals were over. The waiting was over. The clock had finally stopped. But outside that chamber, another story was beginning. The story of what remained. Because an execution can end the life of the person who committed the crime. It cannot undo the crime. It cannot bring the victims back. It cannot return the years that were taken from their families. And it cannot answer every question. Starkweather's final meal had been eaten. His final hour had passed. His final moment had arrived. But the people he killed never received those things. They didn't know when their final hour was coming. They didn't get a final meal. They didn't get time to prepare. They didn't get to say goodbye. And that contrast is important, because the fascination surrounding executions can sometimes make the killer's final moments feel like the conclusion of the story. But they are not. They are only the conclusion of the killer's life. The victims' stories were interrupted much earlier. Robert Colvert never reached the age of 22. Velda Bartlett never got to watch her children grow older. Marion Bartlett never got another ordinary day with his family. Betty Jean Bartlett never got the opportunity to grow up. Robert Jensen never got to become an adult. Carole King never got to see where her life would lead. C. Lower Ward never got to continue his work and family life. Clara Ward never got another day with her husband. Lillian Fenkel never got another ordinary morning. Merle Collison never got to return home from his work. Those are the lives that were lost. And while Starkweather's execution gave the legal system its final answer, it did not give those families their lives back. The prison doors eventually closed. The witnesses left. The newspaper reporters filed their final stories. And the country moved on. But the families could not simply move on in the same way. They had lost people. People whose photographs would eventually become part of an infamous case. People whose names would appear in documentaries decades later. People who would be remembered primarily because of the way their lives ended. But they were more than victims. They were human beings who had lives before Charles Starkweather entered them. And that is where the story eventually has to go. Away from the electric chair, away from the killer, back to the people whose lives were taken. Because once the clock stopped for Starkweather, the clock continued for everyone else. The electric chair had ended Charles Starkweather's life, but it had not ended the story. For the people who lost someone in the killings, June 25, 1959, was not the end of anything. It was simply another date they would remember. The prison could close its doors. The state could declare the sentence complete. The newspapers could publish the final headlines. But grief doesn't work like a prison sentence. It doesn't have a release date. And that is where the Starkweather case becomes less about the man who committed the murders and more about the people who had to live with them. 11 people had been killed. But the number 11 doesn't explain what was lost. It doesn't tell you who those people were. It doesn't tell you what their families expected from them. And it doesn't tell you what their lives might have looked like if they had survived. Robert Colvert was 21. He was working at a service station when Starkweather crossed his path. His name would eventually become one of the first in the Starkweather case. But before that, he was simply a young man earning a living. Then, one encounter changed everything. Velda and Marion Bartlett were living with their family in Lincoln. Their home became one of the most horrifying crime scenes connected to the case. And among the victims was Betty Jean Bartlett. She was only 2 years old. She never had the opportunity to grow up. She never got to attend school. She never got to make adult choices. She never got to discover what kind of person she would become. Her life ended before it had really begun. Then there were Robert Jensen and Carole King. They were teenagers. Their deaths became another chapter in a killing spree that was rapidly expanding. 2 young people who should have had decades ahead of them were suddenly gone. The Ward family brought another set of victims into the case. C. Lauer Ward, his wife, Clara, and Lillian Fenkel, who worked for the household. Again, these were not people who had chosen to become part of a national crime story. They were simply living their lives. And then Starkweather arrived. The final known victim was Merle Collison. Unlike some of the others, Collison had no previous connection to Starkweather. He was a traveling salesman. He was resting in his vehicle near Douglas, Wyoming. He had no reason to believe that a young fugitive was about to cross his path, but that encounter ended his life. And that detail reveals something important about the final stage of the killing spree. The victims weren't all connected by one relationship. They weren't all involved in one conflict. They were simply people who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. That is part of what made the case so frightening to the public. The danger seemed unpredictable. It could reach a family home, a roadside, a service station, a rural community, a parked vehicle, almost anywhere. And while the public remembered the crimes, another story was unfolding around Carol Fugate. Fugate's role remained controversial. She had been 14 years old when the killings occurred. She said Starkweather had threatened her and forced her to cooperate. Prosecutors disagreed. Her trial became another major part of the case. She was eventually convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. Unlike Starkweather, however, her story did not end in 1959. She would spend years in prison before eventually being released on parole. And even after her release, questions about what she knew and what she did remained attached to her name. Was she an unwilling participant? Was she more involved than she admitted? Could a 14-year-old have fully understood what was happening? Those questions have been debated for decades. But there is another question that is sometimes overlooked. What happens to a person who survives a case like this? Carol Fugate survived. The victims' families survived. Investigators survived. Witnesses survived. And they all had to carry the memory of what happened. The case became part of American criminal history. Books were written, articles were published, documentaries were made. The name Starkweather continued to appear whenever discussions turned toward notorious American murder cases, and that created a strange imbalance. The killer became famous. The victims became footnotes. His photograph became recognizable. Their photographs became archival material. His final meal became a detail people remembered. Their final moments were often reduced to a sentence. That is why a documentary about this case should be careful about where it places its attention. The final meal is interesting. The execution is historically significant. The last hour is compelling. But those things should never become more important than the people who were killed. Because Starkweather received something his victims never received. He received time. He knew he was going to die. He knew roughly when. He had a final meal. He had final hours. He had the opportunity to write. He had the opportunity to paint. He had the opportunity to prepare himself psychologically. His victims had none of that. Their final moments came without the certainty that death was approaching. They didn't have a clock counting down. They didn't have a prison waiting for them. They didn't have lawyers. They didn't have appeals. Their lives simply stopped. And perhaps that is the most disturbing contrast in this entire story. The killer had a final hour. The victims did not. The killer had a final meal. The victims did not. The killer had a final walk. The victims did not. And the killer's final moments were witnessed and recorded. The victims' final moments remained largely private. That is why their names deserve to be spoken, not because they were part of one of America's most infamous crime stories, but because they were people before they became victims. They had families. They had jobs. They had routines. They had ordinary days. And ordinary days are easy to overlook until they disappear. A person goes to work. A child wakes up. A couple makes plans. Someone gets into a car. Someone goes to sleep. These things feel permanent when you're living them, until suddenly they aren't. That is what happened in the Starkweather case. Ordinary life collided with extraordinary violence. And after the violence was over, ordinary life had to continue without 11 people. The cemetery eventually became part of that story. Charles Starkweather was buried in Lincoln. Some of the victims were also laid to rest in the same cemetery. The physical distance between graves can be small, but the difference between their stories is enormous. One was the person responsible. The others were people whose lives were taken, and when visitors eventually came to those graves, they were not visiting a crime scene. They were visiting someone's final resting place. That distinction matters, because true crime can sometimes make the past feel like entertainment. A headline, a mystery, a shocking twist. But behind every case file are people who once laughed, worked, argued, loved, worried, planned, and dreamed. The Starkweather case is no different. More than 6 decades have passed. Yet the names remain. The photographs remain. The newspaper archives remain. And the questions remain. Could the first murder have been prevented? Could the later murders have been stopped? Could someone have recognized what was happening sooner? Could the violence have ended earlier? There are questions historians can investigate. But there are also questions that may never have definitive answers. What matters is that the violence eventually stopped, and when it did, the legal system delivered its final punishment. Charles Starkweather was dead. But his name would survive. That is one of the strange realities of criminal history. A person can die and still become more famous after death. Their crimes are studied. Their photographs circulate. Their final words are repeated. Their last meal becomes trivia. Their execution becomes part of history. But fame is not the same as importance. The most important people in this story were not the ones who became famous. They were the ones whose futures disappeared. 11 lives, 11 stories. And behind every one of those stories was a family that had to keep living. The case had ended legally, but emotionally, there was no simple ending. There was no courtroom verdict capable of restoring the dead. There was no execution capable of undoing the murders. There was only memory. And memory is what remained when everything else was gone. Charles Starkweather's clock stopped in June 1959. But for the people he left behind, the clock kept moving. And there was still one part of his story that remained worth examining. Not what he did, not where he went, not even how he died, but how a 19-year-old became capable of creating so much destruction in such a short period of time. That question has never had one simple answer, and perhaps it never will. For Charles Starkweather, there was a moment when everything became history. The moment the electric chair was activated. The moment when the final chapter of his life became a fact rather than a possibility. But for everyone else connected to the case, there was no such moment. There was no switch that could turn off the memories, no sentence that could make the families forget, no execution that could restore what had been taken. The law had finished its work, life had not, and perhaps that is the best place to end the story. Not with the chair, not with the killer, but with what remained after the noise disappeared. The Starkweather case had begun with an ordinary teenager in Nebraska. Then came Robert Colvert. Then the Bartlett family. Then Robert Jensen and Carole King. Then C. Lauer Ward, Clara Ward, and Lillian Fenkel. Then Merle Collison. 11 people, a series of decisions, a trail of violence, and eventually a nationwide manhunt. The story moved from Nebraska into Wyoming, from private homes to highways, from crime scenes to police stations, from interrogation rooms to a courtroom, and finally from a prison cell to the execution chamber. It was a journey measured in miles, but it was also measured in time. The most famous image of Starkweather's story is often the electric chair. But that is not where the story should end, because the electric chair tells us how he died. It doesn't tell us what was lost. The victims were not statistics. They were not merely names in a police report. They were people. Robert Colvert had a future. Velda Bartlett had a family. Marion Bartlett had a life. Betty Jean Bartlett had barely begun hers. Robert Jensen and Carole King were teenagers. C. Lauer Ward and Clara Ward had a life together. Lillian Fenkel had her own life and relationships. Merle Collison was a working man traveling through Wyoming. Each person had a world beyond the case, and that world disappeared when they did. That is the real scale of the tragedy. 11 deaths didn't just remove 11 people. They changed the lives of everyone connected to them. Parents lost children. Children lost parents. Friends lost friends. Families lost futures they had expected to share. And those consequences did not end when Starkweather was executed. They continued. Years passed. Decades passed. The people who remembered the murders grew older. Some eventually died, but the story survived. New generations learned the name Charles Starkweather. They saw the photographs. They read the newspapers. They heard about the murders. And eventually, they heard about the final meal. Cold cuts. A small detail from an enormous story. The last food he would ever eat. The last hours. The final walk. The electric chair. Those details attract attention because they are intimate. They allow us to imagine what it feels like to know that death is approaching. But there is another side to that question. Imagine not knowing. Imagine being one of the victims. Imagine waking up believing that you still have tomorrow. That is the difference between the killer's final hour and the victim's final moments. Starkweather knew his life was ending. His victims didn't. He had a calendar. They didn't. He had a final meal. They didn't. He had a final night. They didn't. And he had people waiting outside the execution chamber who knew what was about to happen. His victims had no such warning. That contrast is perhaps the most powerful thing to remember when looking back at this case. The execution may have been the end of Starkweather's story, but it was never the end of the victims' stories. Their families carried them forward. Their names remained. Their photographs remained. Their graves remained. And their absence remained. That is what time does. It doesn't always erase tragedy. Sometimes it simply moves it farther into the past. More than 60 years have passed since Starkweather's execution. But the case still appears in discussions of American criminal history. Why? Because it represents more than one murderer. It represents a moment when a series of crimes shocked an entire region. It represents the fear created by a young fugitive moving across state lines. It represents the difficulty of understanding why someone chooses to kill. It represents the questions surrounding Carl Fugate's role. It represents the death penalty. And it represents the uncomfortable fascination people have with a condemned person's final hours. But beneath all of that is something much simpler. People died, and they mattered. That should be the final thought, not the killer's photograph, not the electric chair, not the final meal. The people, the families, the lives, the futures. Because Charles Starkweather's life ended in approximately 4 minutes inside a Nebraska prison. But the lives he destroyed did not end in that prison. Their consequences continued outside its walls, and their memories continued long after the prison doors closed. The clock stopped for Charles Starkweather, but for everyone else, it kept moving. And perhaps that is the most important ending this story can have. Because in true crime, the person who commits the crime often becomes the most recognizable name. But recognition is not remembrance. Remembering means looking beyond the person who caused the tragedy. It means remembering the people who never got another morning, the people who never got another birthday, the people who never got another ordinary day. So when the name Charles Starkweather is mentioned, remember the name of the victims too. Remember that behind the headlines were 11 human beings, 11 lives, 11 families, 11 futures that were never allowed to unfold. And that is where this story ends. Not with a killer, but with the people who deserved to live. The clock stopped for Charles Starkweather, but the memory of his victims did not. If you stayed until the end, if you appreciate long-form true crime documentaries that focus on the facts, the victims, the investigation, and the human stories behind notorious cases, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We're working toward 50,000 subscribers, and every subscription helps us continue bringing these stories to you. And if this case made you think differently about the way true crime stories are told, let me know in the comments. Should documentaries spend more time telling the victims' stories instead of focusing on the killers? I'll see you in the next case.